Man, one thing you told me about a long time ago was that second moon on the Earth. Um, I can't remember the name of it now.
Carithne.
Yeah.
Yeah, Carithne is a funny moon.
It's very interesting. After looking into it some.
Its orbit is like a giant horseshoe.
Yeah.
Have we ever talked about shepherd moons?
No, but I would love to right now, real quick. We have one who just hopped on the stream, so appreciate that. All right, so yeah, shepherd moons.
All right, let's talk real quick about shepherd moons. Shepherd moons were discovered by Voyager. When we got up to Voyager, we saw these cool rings of Saturn, but some of them were like twisty. We're like, why twisty ring? How do you get twisty rings? Like, if rings are these orbiting material, how do they get twisted? And this is actually for people who say, well, we've never been there. Well, it's pretty hard to explain how the theory of shepherd moons was invented for the purpose of making a hoax, because we didn't have a clue about them until Voyager got up there. And what we found is that when we have moons that are very close to each other in orbit, like here's the lines of a couple moons in orbit, right?
Yeah.
Right, well, the one that's farther away tends to go slower than the one that's closer. So the one that's on the inside track tends to catch up to the one that's on the outside track.
Yeah.
And then when they get close, because of the force between them, that slows, that speeds this guy up and pulls this guy down.
It's almost like drafting or something.
It is like, it's exactly like drafting. It's like gravitational drafting.
That's awesome.
And then those moons will switch spots. So the guy that was on that was ahead, the guy that's come along from behind and catching up, he gets pulled into a higher position.
Yeah.
This guy gets pulled back in the lower position. And
very interesting.
And they switch. The one that's lower gets away and laps the outer one, and then around the so. And you know what? I'm being a pain in the butt. Let me explain about orbits real quick.
Well, one thing while you're on that same thing, I try to, when I said drafting there, I think this helps me in those moments is I try to think of something I can relate to always, and then just like scale out. So when you were showing that, it was like, you know what? If something was way up here looking at the sky, showing that right there, what would that describe that I can relate to? It looked just like drafting, what you were describing.
It is a type of drafting.
Yeah, and so
but you understand that orbits are weird.
Yeah.
Orbits are precessional, meaning everything happens at right angles. With an orbit, with orbits, with any planet, with any moon, the closer you are to the primary, the faster you have to go.
Yeah.
So that's why the space shuttle, as it travels around the Earth, takes 90 minutes, but then 30,000 miles away, you have these geosynchronous orbits that take 24 hours because they move so slow. Well, shepherd moons happen when the two moons are really, really close to each other. When the fast one in the bottom catches up with the one that's on the higher orbit, the one that's on the bottom gets pulled into a higher orbit because he gets sped up. But in a higher orbit, he goes slower. And I know that sounds backwards, but that's how it works. And the one that was in the higher orbit gets pulled down. He gets slowed down, so he drops into a lower orbit, which makes him faster. So then the lower one takes off on a faster track than the higher one, and it laps it all the way around again.
Right on.
And this is what shepherd moons do. They constantly swap. It's like a baton race, and they swap. And of course, if you're talking about two little rocks on Saturn's moons, we're talking about a difference in the orbit of like a few miles an hour. It might take years for it to catch up.
Yeah.
And of course, with Saturn's moon, that's kind of going on all the time. Well, Carithne is exactly the same idea, except that as Earth runs around, and I guess I should back up here.
So when the Earth gets further, or when the Earth's making its orbit, Carithne is taking a certain trajectory, but when Earth's making its orbit again, the trajectory kind of makes a U-turn and makes the horseshoe. Is that kind of it?
Yes. In other words, Carithne is kind of like a shepherd planet, and its crazy orbit is this ridiculous horseshoe shape like that. So if this is the sun and this is the Earth, here's Carithne's orbit in this ridiculous horseshoe.
Interesting.
as it does this sort of shepherd moon dance with the Earth.
A dance is a good way to describe that. It kind of comes across like a dance. It's like as the Earth, and it like almost as if the Earth's taking lead, and to a certain extent. Or do I have that flipped?
No, it's just like the shepherd moons. Caryphony is teeny. It's like a little asteroid, so it doesn't really affect Earth's orbit that much. Earth mostly does all the work on Caryphony.
Interesting. Well, and kind of to tie that into what we're talking about, what we're going to be talking about with theism, atheism. It's interesting you bring up shepherd moon as a name for that, considering shepherd to bring you to a higher orbit, the good shepherd, higher orbits. Let's rock theism and atheism, baby. And
and that's a fine intro because you're gonna describe how. Well, you know what? I'll let you do it because it's really your baby this time.
Well, my whole, I guess, thought on this is I feel like we need to have a real discussion, a real acknowledgement that theism and atheism are both constructions of man's interpretation of their relationship with the universe, but neither are actually necessarily substantive. They can be, but they're not by themselves. So that's an important distinction, because if something's not substantive by itself, it's not an argument by itself, right? And so if you have an atheism argument or a theism argument, you can't just say atheism can win because you have to say atheism because, right? So you have to add in the substance. And I think people have forgotten that. And the reason you have to do that is because both theism and atheism have been proven to not work. And that's...
Hold on. They don't work in what sense?
What I mean is, I guess both lead to genocidal outcomes in their own context. And so if we're going to go to the extreme, what I mean by this is the largest argument you get from an atheist or a theist in these discussions are people have died so many times of religion. Oh, yeah, well, the Ruskies killed a shitload in communism. And it's like this discussion just proves both very fallible. and that's an important thing to talk about because there's options beyond theism and atheism.
Or perhaps between them.
Exactly. There's bridges there to be had, mediators, for lack of a better phrase.
All right. So you know what? This is an idea I learned ages ago, and it actually kind of gave me a little bit of respect for them. You said they're both constructed. I'm going to use the same phrase that I learned way back when that fits here, because I think that's when we talk about nihilism that comes from some of these atheistic political views. We're talking about like law and order, right?
Yeah.
I think that's what they're both trying to do here. They're both trying to construct a world. They're both trying to put, measurement and judgment and conclusions down for this, that, and the other thing.
And we're going to tie this in later in more detail, but I think it's important what you just said. I like how you said that much better than I did. Building or how did you put that? It's kind of the way people build world building. And it's an important distinction that when we say flipping the tables, the person who did that happened to be called a carpenter as we go along in this discussion. Because when you're talking about world building, it's important to know that that you have to look at the type of verbiage, the type of symbolism that's given, because what my theory at the end of this is going to be is we have to pull the right actions. Not the right statements, but the right actions from history. And as we look into that, I think we're going to be looking at a carpenter pretty frequently.
That's what you mean when you say they're both substances.
Yeah.
Arguments are not the whole story.
Exactly. Statements form the goal of a structure or the objective of a structure. But what happens once that structure is formed is what that structure actually is. Right, and this inability to actually
hold on, that's an evolutionary concept. You realize that, right? Like one once something's created, this is a very common thing. In fact, in biology, most things have more than one function. And some things have three functions. And that's why, because once something gets created, it might be good for something else.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of weird examples all over biology about like things like how do they even get here in the first place? Like nipples. Like what was the intermediate stage between not having a nipple and then having a nipple?
Yeah.
There's a creature called a chinchilla, and they have these teeny little hands. And if you look really closely, you'll see on one finger there's like these really specialized little pile of whiskers. And it's basically like a little scrub brush. They got a little scrub brush built into one finger for like scratch and stuff, right? All the rest of their fingers don't have those whiskers. It's just the one that has that special. Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy.
That's wild.
But yeah, it's the things we make.
Yeah,
it's the outcomes. It's the structures. It's the artifacts.
Yeah. So the skunk's defense system, right, is like an oversweated gland that has an extra scent or stink or smell to it, right? And it's interesting how that kind of a thing would come along over time, and you can see how that might form. But what it might have been at its beginning form, this oversweating gland, becoming a defense system, right? There's a good opportunity that you can predict that it wasn't intended as a defense system. It's an oversweating gland that stinks. But when it's put in practice, it becomes this very effective spray that is able to work as an immensely successful defense system. And that's the difference between like maybe even in the world in nature, the initial concept behind something versus its structural impact when in relationship with other environments around it.
The electric eel is another good example. They believe that the electric eel grew his powers from a sensory system. Like he would send out electrical signals, and the hammerhead shark, they got that big fat head, right? The hammerhead shark, the reason his head is that shape is because it's a giant antenna. Hammerhead sharks cruise around on the bottom, using basically like a metal detector.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it's their radio, and they're looking for the nervous signals of creatures, and they think the electric eel kind of developed the same way by starting out as a sensory system, but then every once in a while, it was so strong, some small creature would get knocked sideways, which means he could get caught really easy, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
And so all of a sudden, a really strong electric power is what came into the fore. This all sounds like something that I first heard about. I want to say it was from Friedrich Hayek, who talked about. It was Karl Popper. And he talked about how our bodies have theories built in.
Yeah. This is why intuition and learning and crafting the sense and ability to listen to intuition is such an important part that we really neglect as a culture entirely, because our body, I do think, our body creates theories with nature and the universe around it all the time, constantly.
Well, this is very similar to what we said earlier the other day about DNA thinking being like wetware, being like there's this sort of physical calculation that goes on at a chemical level. But the thing that we're kind of moving away from, and I just want to bring it back, just like we can say bodily structure to theories, our moral systems are kind of like theories that society develops.
Amen. For lack of a better phrase, and importantly on that, this is a question I think we all need to ask: is it possible for an acknowledgement of vastly capable for immorality beings to craft truly moral systems?
Wait, hold on. Moral defined how?
Well, that's the first question. If you're going to build a moral system out of immoral beings, the first question is moral as you mean how. And that's there in which, this is what my point to that is, where theism and atheism have a fundamental flaw, is the immorality of those who construct atheism and theism. In other words, we are immoral in a sense of we're all capable of doing things we know are wrong. I'll define it as that. I have done things with the knowledge that it was the wrong thing to do to someone else. Not because the law told me it was, not because I was conditioned into believing it was something was, but this feeling that it was the wrong thing to do was there, and I still did it. This is something we all struggle with on a daily basis. And the question should be asked, can people or beings or species who have truly inherited this immorality, can they craft moral systems? So before you, and that's the fatal flaw.
I'm going to change that instead. I changed that to flawed. Can flawed or imperfect beings?
There we go. That's a better way to put it.
Because if you think back to the ancient historical traditions, everybody knows God's standards are way too high. Right?
No doubt. Even God knows his standards are too high because that's why he has to grant forgiveness. I mean, if you believe in that kind of a theology with God and sin and born into sin and forgiveness and mercy, even God knows that. Even God knows his standards are too high. So to the degree of which he knows he has to grant forgiveness because no one can meet them.
Well, and that's why I'm saying that I'm changing it from immoral to flawed.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a better way to put it.
Imperfect creatures make truly moral systems. All right, that seems like one of those questions that doesn't have an answer, and here's why. Who's judging whether it's truly a moral system?
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean there? Like, how can we possibly answer this either way? Maybe
you're exactly right. I think one way you kind of could try, and we've been doing it throughout all of humanity, is to test everything and throw away what's bad, or also known as try, review, assess, adjust, hypothesize, theorize, test again. So in other words, what we're going to, try, review, revise, try again. Maybe that's a good way to put it. And then, but yeah, I like that too. But basically just and we've been doing that for a long time, but we seem to be either regressing or stuck for some time forever due to that debate of theism and atheism.